to this special public lecture. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, who is coming together with his wife Mary, all the way from Australia, to encourage us once more in our thought and discussion around the Christian faith and climate change. Professor Clive Pearson was formerly the principal of United Theological College in Sydney and head of the School of Theology. Today he is a senior research fellow in public theology at Charles Sturt University. He is currently the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Public Theology and once was one of the founders of the Global Network of Public Theology. He has written extensively on the theological response to ecology, climate change, and the dawning of the Anthropocene. He has supervised a significant number of doctoral theses in this field. He has also written and supervised in the fields of cross-cultural and diasporic theologies, including the Lebanese diaspora to Australia. Very special work that we are involved in somehow, because it's also about our own story in Australia, so it's great. And Reverend Gabby, who wrote that dissertation, is also with us today. So welcome, Dr. Clive. We are very happy to have you, and we are eager to hear what you have to say about this incredibly important topic. Welcome.
Well, good evening. First of all, thank you to Nest for the invitation to be able to speak to you this evening. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. When you're a guest speaker from overseas, you always wonder if anyone's going to turn up, so thank you for coming. And those of us in Australia are very, very mindful of the many crises that are facing Lebanon at the present time, and so I bring you the greetings of the moderator of our synod back in the United Church in Australia. I first began to do research into the environment and theology by accident. I was at a congregational camp, and one of the benefits of being at a congregational camp is that the minister can take time out. And a young laywoman, she gave the address for that day, and we were in a lovely state forest, and she said, "I've never heard a sermon on the care of creation." And I thought, neither have I, and neither have I given one. And then I considered the people in my congregation and what some of them were working in. Some of them were in meteorology, some were in the management of soils, management of water and what have you. And I was asking myself, what's the connection between their workday world and what happens on Sunday? And I thought, not a lot. And so that was the beginning, I think, of research, supervision, writing in this field, now for over 30 years. And it's a territory which is fast changing. And so what I wanted to do in my address this evening is not the pamphlet that you have with you. I wrote that on a previous visit to Lebanon. This is a more up-to-date version, where I want to reflect first of all on why should theology be interested in climate change. Part two will begin to look at why it is a form of public theology, and I have one or two comments about Lebanon in there. And the third part is just to give you a very brief summary of what some work in this field is at the present time. I'm very conscious that I come from a context that is not yours, and I'm also very much aware that I'm running over the surface of things as I speak to you this evening. So what has climate change got to do with theology? For much of Christian history, not much. In one rather obvious way, that is no fault of past theologians. For most of Christian history, the possibility of changes to climate through the release of greenhouse gases was never anticipated. The prospect of such a turn was not raised in the relevant sciences prior to 1896. The Swedish physical chemist Svante Arrhenius first predicted that changes in the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels could substantially alter the surface temperatures of the Earth through the greenhouse effect, 1896. Writing in his Climate Change, a very short introduction, Mark Maslin observed that there was then a significant delay in realising the full significance of subsequent scientific research in the field. And that was only overcome during the 1980s with the publication of a number of key reports, the founding of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Rio Earth Summit, and the general rise in environmental awareness. It is no surprise then that there is no long history of a theology of climate change. The recent work of Sigurd Bergman on weather, climate and religion also assumes that it's dependent upon a distinction that should be made between weather and climate. The latter, and hence the capacity to discern fundamental changes that go beyond our daily experience of the consequences of atmosphere, depends upon the emergence of meteorology and its increasing levels of technical and instrumental precision. And to that we could now add climate sciences and earth system sciences. There are reasons then that have to do with the very nature of climate change why theology has been something of a late arrival up to this discussion. That absence, though, is also partly due to the nature of the ecological witness of the Church. Throughout Christian history, there has been a certain reserve with regards to matters ecological and the care of creation, under which rubric climate change is closely related. One of the earliest pioneers of thinking in this broader field, Paul Santmeyer, discerned an ambiguity in the Christian ecological promise. The minority tradition, exemplified by Francis of Assisi, and today by the papal encyclical Laudato Si, does encourage an ecological sensitivity. But the majority tradition, however, has been highly anthropocentric and inclined towards a focus on the human subject, personal salvation, rather than the whole of creaturely existence. The founding father of the Earth Bible series, Norman Harvell, was much more blunt. The tendency of much Christian thinking and practice has been towards heavenism, and thus a disregard of the future of life in this world and Earth's disposability. Paul Santmeyer captured that in a caricature when he commented upon a slogan which was found on the back of cars in the 1970s and 80s: in case of the rapture, this car will be driverless. The cumulative effect of this neglect was most vividly represented in the hypothesis proposed by Lynn White Jr. in the late 1960s. He argued that the Judeo-Christian tradition was responsible for the ecological crisis through its advocacy of the authority and dominion of the human subject over the rest of creation. Genesis chapter 1, verses 28 to 30. White overstated the case, and in the intervening years the ecological crisis in general has become progressively more focused upon the threats by that umbrella term, climate change. How well theology has been poised for such a change, how well theology has been poised for a fit-for-purpose response is debatable. With the benefit of hindsight, theology could have been ahead of the play. The recent upsurge in research on how weather has played a part in the way in which the activity and purposes of God have been described across the ages might well have alerted us to the need for eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to understand. The weather has long been linked with the activity of God going right back into the biblical texts themselves. Bergman, for instance, identified how the weather has been a barometer of God's love and morality. It has been a screen for the projection of God's presence and moral relation to his or her created beings. In ways that might often have gone unnoticed, the weather has been a device in the history and drama of salvation. It was perceived to be a system of signs where one could read and understand the relation of God to the people of God and to the world in general. In a variation on this theme, Peter Thusen has paid particular attention to the responses to those who have suffered the devastating effects of tornadoes in the United States. The awe and wonder of unpredictable and extreme weather has frequently led to cries of theodicy, the judgment of a punitive God, a day of wrath, why does God let these things happen, and so on. The nature of these responses should not be too surprising for theology. The biblical text is full of references to the whirlwind of the Lord, the God of storms, not to mention those to do with crashing thunder and lightning that lights up the world, as well as floods. In medieval times, the four winds were reckoned to be the winds of the apocalypse. There is an obvious need, though, for much care to be placed around apocalyptic texts and thinking that can be otherwise irresponsibly used. Take the saga of Noah and the flood, for example. The low-lying islands of the Pacific, the liquid continent, are often described as Job-like nations. No part of the Tuvalu group, which almost straddles the equator, is more than 3 meters above sea level. It is likely that these islands will become uninhabitable within a few decades. They will do so at a time when there is no international law that recognises the existence and rights of climate-displaced persons. Jane McAdam has noted that the oft-employed term climate refugee is in fact a pre-legal term. It has no status, besides which legal theorists have observed how hard it would be to prove that someone has migrated as a climate refugee, and at what point in the scale of vulnerability they became so. Now and then the islanders, like those in Kiribati and the Marshall Islands, with the support of the Association of Small Island States, are able to delay discussions of climate summits, as indeed they did at Copenhagen in 2009. But the truth is, they are what the activist Maina Talia has described as weak actors on the geopolitical stage. In terms of carbon, rather than climate justice, an idea coined by Jeremy Moss, a philosopher, the harmful emissions these islands produce is infinitesimal, around 0.0005%, and yet their islands are destined to disappear. The people of these islands are deeply Christian, 99%. Sione Havea has described them as a Bible-conscious people. In their context of rising sea levels, the Noah saga is never far from popular understanding. Tafui Lasama describes how many islanders turn towards the covenantal promise Yahweh makes with Noah and every living creature that there will never again be such a flood. It's easy to see the appeal of such a text. Wolfgang Kempf seeks to understand why this response happens, when it seems to conflict with the rising anxiety as the islands become more and more at risk. Examples of which can be seen very vividly in Kiribati, where a former president, Antone Tong, refused to have a church building demolished. It was once on land, but it now stands in the ocean, and he insisted that it remain there in order to bear witness to what was transpiring. The Noah saga can then be seen, according to Wolfgang Kempf, as an attempt by the vulnerable islanders to impose their own understanding of what happens when king tides invade the land, the seawater bubbles up underneath the coral, and more intense tropical cyclones batter the land. It allows them some agency and distance from climate science experts whose narrative for them is far too highly technical and rather removed from the mix of indigenous and religious beliefs. In an article by Hannah Fair, though, an indigenous person she wrongly names as Ezekiel simply responds by noting that he and his fellow islanders really are the ones who did not make it onto the ark. They're all at sea. Talia picks up the catch cry, "We are drowning now." He draws upon Stanley Cohen's theory of different types of denial and suggests that the comfort that is sought for in this turn to the Noah covenant is actually itself a form of denial. He shifts the biblical narrative away from the Noah story towards the parable of the Good Samaritan. He organises side events at COP conferences and addresses parliaments in various parts of the world along the lines of the question, "Am I not your tuakoi? Am I not your neighbour?" In his reading of the parable, the man set upon is a whakalofa. He is homeless. But in the absence of international obligations on climate-displaced persons, the inn where the Samaritan takes the victim has not yet been built. This case study illustrates what can happen if theological inquiry does not critically engage with climate change. Its absence can allow vexatious and misleading claims to be made in the name of faith. In writing about the recent politics of climate change in the United States, Thusen was able to show how the dismantling of many environmental and climate policies during the Trump era were carried through by those who were a particular type of Christian and whose interpretation of faith allowed them to be in effect in climate denial. What Musama and Talia show in their local context is how important it is a substantive theological research in the local setting. And Talia went one step further and showed the need for such to speak into the worldwide geopolitics of climate change and do so on the basis of faith. The presence of that disciplined voice that is proactive can then offer more realistic alternatives to those most likely to be adversely affected by those seeking protection in biblical narratives that were never intended to address their plight. In so doing, Musama and Talia stand inside an emerging eco-theological tradition that seeks to acknowledge that this creation is God's good creation. Some years ago, before climate change became the dominant concern of an ecological theology, Sally McFaig argued that the failure to act on the loss of biodiversity and other matters would lead to the human species to be responsible for reversing God's good act of creation. We would become responsible for what she called uncreation. In a one-line aside, McFaig provocatively wrote, and that would be a heresy. By way of an aside, the philosopher of the Anthropocene, Clive Hamilton, has already published a book that goes by the title Requiem for a Species, and that species is us. There is need then for theology to engage with climate change for a rather defensive reason. With regards to eco-theology in general, Elizabeth Johnson had spoken of the need to sift the theological traditions. It is entirely possible for some biblical scripts to be levered out of their context and be made to perform a task that justifies not just indifference, but real harm and danger to our fellow earthlings. It does so in a way that violates the principles of that fixed term, climate justice. The philosopher Henry Shue prefers here to speak of a compound injustice. The dilemma he wrestles with is, how does the need to address the planetary threat of climate change cut across the historic forms of injustice that were derived from eras of imperialism, colonialism, and the exploitation of resources? Can concerns for climate mitigation be separated from that legacy? Can that be so if and when formerly colonized societies are likely to be among the most vulnerable sites to climate change and the least able to afford their population with the necessary protections, one might say, sanctuary? Leonardo Boff found himself having to address the familiar complaint leading into the Rio Earth Summit. The claim was made that the ecological crisis, which we now say is climate change, is a luxury of rich countries. Boff would set out to address two wounds, poverty and ecology. But one would have to say today, the threat posed by climate change since Boff wrote 30 years ago has deepened and intensified the compound injustice. Can theology ignore the concerns of climate change if, in the first instance, the missionary endeavours of the Christian faith were heavily implicated in that imperial project? Can it remain silent in the face of issues to do with theodicy that will play themselves out unevenly around the globe as climate change deepens? What does the call to love one's neighbour as oneself mean in such a time? Sharon Delgado will speak of love in a time of climate change, while Cynthia Moy Lebeda has proposed a Christian ethic of neighbourly love. There are more substantive reasons, though, for the need for theology to engage with climate change. They flow from a Christian anthropology. That is the question of who we are in the sight of God and how we relate to the rest of creation. The issue is not simply one of whether or not we're called to be stewards of the earth, guardians, or in the orthodox language of John Caesiodus, the priests of creation. There is a reality that lies beneath these things. Berkman's own work proceeds on the basis that humanity is dependent upon climate. We rely as human beings on the interactions of atmosphere, water, the land, the elements that go into the making of climate. We are, so he argues, atmospheric beings. We live within what he calls weather worlds. It is an aspect of our capacity to be human, to be creatures of God in a creation that is God-given. Bergman goes so far as to insist that climate itself is a gift of God, and that climate is without doubt the theatre where human existence, human history is taking place. In his encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis rightly described climate as a common good. If this is so, then the plausibility of the Christian faith is at stake in how it engages in a matter that has now been described as a super-wicked problem. It almost goes without saying now that human-induced climate change is putting our only home, the Earth, at great risk. It necessarily raises the problems of intergenerational justice and the need for what has been called a future ethics. What we do or do not do now has consequences, as is suggested by the designation of climate being a super-wicked problem. The marks of a super-wicked problem are as follows. Time is running out. Those who cause the problem are the ones also seeking to provide the solution. The central authority needed to address them is weak or non-existent. And finally, the tendency is towards letting the necessary measures to be left to the future. The complexity of the task leads the theologian and ethicist Willis Jennings to argue that theology must now engage in a transdisciplinary mode. That is, theology must engage with other disciplines and bring to the table what it can, recognise the limits of its own discourse, and be open to what others have to say. It must win the right to speak in a dialogical rather than dogmatic matter, and engage in a public sphere in what has been identified as a conversation with strangers. Part 2. One of the distinctive features of a public theology is its interest in discerning the signs of the times and kairos moments. That reference to signs of the times is, of course, an allusion back to Jesus' address to the crowds in the Gospel of Luke. When you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say it's going to rain, and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say that will be scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites! You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? That saying has more obvious meaning in this part of the world than it does in mine, where I live on the east coast of Australia. The winds are all coming in the wrong direction here. It is the one time Jesus offers what today we might call a weather report. Strictly speaking, it is an eschatological sign. Amy Jill Levine and Ben Witherington note that it is an analogy that works on the premise that those who are wise enough to interpret earthly signs should be wise enough to see what is coming on the horizon. The dilemma lies in how the crowds who have not yet entered into the Messianic age do not recognise who Christ is, and the breaking in of the kingdom through what can be seen in his public ministry. This particular text is sometimes unplugged from its original setting in Luke and put to use in the service of a public theology. So much in this move depends upon the word Luke uses for time, kairos, the right time, the opportune time, the God-given moment of disclosure, as distinct from chronos time, linear time, calendar time. This turn to the kairos moment with regards to climate change has been privileged by the Norwegian theologian Kjetil Fredheim. In his Interruption and Imagination, Fredheim plays with the idea of kairos time being a crisis or crisis time. It represents a rupture of ordered time. Fredheim captures the theological imperative that lies behind the kairos being the moment of revelation, the time when the will of God and truth are made visible and evident in a special way. It necessarily refers to discerning the present time in terms of what Jesus' coming and resurrection means today, and what the coming of the kingdom of God to our world means for our understanding of the world, our time, and our own society. It becomes a time for repentance, a time to stand up and speak out. Like many other theologians working in a similar field, Fredheim will employ the category of kairos time in his understanding of public theology. The Cambridge theologian David Ford has succinctly placed this concern for a public faith within what he identified as an ecology of theology. Briefly, he argued that theology has three primary audiences: the church, the academy, and the public domain, which one might add is manifested very differently from one society to another. Ford argued that the one of these three audience or spheres that was most vulnerable to being dispensed with, forgotten, or neglected is the public domain. Theology is often more comfortable in the academy and in the church than in the public domain. Faced with that risk, Fretheim argues the case for what he calls a kairotic public theology. And here the word kairos is a key term. It assumes that a public theology is articulated and developed in a time of crisis. It suggests that the present is no ordinary time, but a special time that is both an opportunity to change and to take action. That emphasis on crisis leads Fretheim to focus upon unprecedented climate change. With evident approval, he cites the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew. For the human race as a whole, there is now a kairos, a decisive time in our relationship with God's creation. We will either act in time to protect life and earth from the worst consequences of human folly, or we will fail to act. Fretheim made free use of the rhetoric of crisis with reference to climate change, and that is not surprising. The planetary context in which theology is now being done is changing. The Christian faith, like other major world religions, came into being and flourished in a period known as the Holocene, in which the climate of the earth was relatively stable. It is a period that has lasted for 11,500 years, but it is coming to a close in our lifetimes. One of the working groups of the Stratigraphy Commission, led by Jan Zalasiewicz, has proposed that the Holocene came to a close in 1945, and we have now entered the Anthropocene, the age of humans. We have done so in a way that the historian of the Anthropocene, J.T. McNeill, has described as the Great Acceleration. What might be the significance of this rupture of geologic time? The Stratigraphy Commission is itself a geological agency, but this language of the Anthropocene is now passing into the earth system sciences, philosophy, the social sciences, popular culture, and indeed theology as well. It is still a contested hypothesis, but earth systems scientists like Will Steffen has led a team that has plotted the trajectory of the thresholds upon which life as we know it depends towards what they describe as a hothouse Earth. Steffen and co. make use of the image of a valley to explain what is happening. In the Holocene, yes, there were variations in climate, but it was as if they unfolded in a braided river where the watercourse meandered from one side of the valley to the other. Steffen suggests that the Anthropocene is another valley altogether. And so our species is now in an unprecedented territory. It is likely the Earth of the future will be hotter than it has ever been for human life in the past. In terms of the metaphor of the valley, it is no longer possible for us to return to the valley of the Holocene. Through a series of 4 questions that flowed from the core concern as to whether there is a planetary threshold we cross, mediated a sense of urgency through a consideration of tipping points that might provide a domino-like cascade effect. It is no wonder that theologian Catherine Keller has written of how we are facing an apocalypse, and the current earth pains present us with the mother of last chances. The dawning of the Anthropocene intensifies how climate change becomes that super wicked problem. It is certainly not tame. Into this mix now comes the emerging discipline of climate attribution science. The past reluctance to assign the impact of climate change on extreme weather events has been replaced with notions of angry weather. Angry weather, a term used by Federica Otto, and which ever since 2015 attracts the research of climate scientists in a number of major institutions around the world as they seek to make robust peer-reviewed assessments of particular incidences of extreme rainfall, extreme storms, and extreme heat. To what extent has climate change enhanced the level of vulnerability and real-time weather events and intensified their impact. In a similar vein to Otto, but without the adjectival qualifier of anger, Chris Funk likewise explores how drought, flood and fire, how climate change contributes to catastrophes. And we in Sydney know about that because in November 2019 we were described as the world's third most livable cities. Within a few weeks, the east coast of Australia was aflame, fires up and down the coast, and we were then enjoying, masked before COVID, because we had the worst air to breathe in the world. The science of climate attribution and the increasingly used language of catastrophe has been matched by other fresh terms. There is now a great deal more research being carried out about cities, the roles they play in reducing carbon emissions, as well as in their design, their expressions of vulnerability and resilience. It is a work which has been carried out because the greatest number of people who will be affected by climate change live in cities. Through its theology, the Christian faith has had a long interest in what makes for a good city, so it becomes part of our interest. Into this brief, the idea of an extreme city has been advanced by Ashley Dawson. What is meant here is nothing to do with the size per se, but rather the capacity to weather the storms that are bearing down upon humanity. This definition of extreme is motivated by a concern for the precariousness of urban life and a certain scepticism towards the much-cited aim of resilience and its dependence upon the quality of bounce back. Dawson makes no reference to climate attribution science, but arguably makes a theoretical call for its necessity. He noted the tendency of climate prediction to be done at a remove from the specificities of where most people live or are likely to live. The dilemma that arises lies in the way in which weather events, the day-to-day expressions of climate, do not occur at a global or hemispheric level. Severe storms, floods, heat waves, droughts, and perhaps most importantly, daily fluctuations in temperature only occur in any experiential way on the scale of regions. The deepening nature of this crisis is made plain in the regular reports coming out of the IPCC. The sense of escalating urgency was evident at COP27, where the report offered a final warning on the attempt to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is not likely that this warning will be reversed at COP28 in Dubai later this year. Here in Lebanon, the rhetoric of crisis and threat is alive and well. Whether climate change would attract the public theologians seeking to discern the signs of the times in this setting is a moot point. There are so many competing urgent demands, and they require the best of intention. But what if climate change is the elephant in the room, as was suggested by Asad Rasouk in the Beirut Daily Star back in 2014? What if it is so, and does so in a variety of ways that affect the lessening of rainfall, a decline in snowmelt, an increase in vulnerability to fire, a greater risk of intense heat, all of which put pressure on health, the movements of people, security, and the ability to produce sufficient food? The language of crisis and catastrophe punctuates the fourth national communication sent on to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change last year. In her foreword, Melanie Hohenstein, the resident representative of the UN on this panel, declared that climate change is the most challenging crisis of our times, and its adverse impacts pose significant threats to sustainable livelihoods, security, and the well-being of people in Lebanon. The report was submitted mindful of the port explosion, the impact of COVID, as well as the political, humanitarian, economic, and financial crises. One of the consequences of these crises is that these other crises has led to a reduction in carbon emissions. In the reporting period, we're one of the few countries that's been able to do that. But that finding needs to be handled with great care. The same pressures had meant that no major legislation with regard to mitigation and adaptation has been taken, which there are significant knowledge gaps to do with the collection of data and the institutional arrangements institutional arrangements for managing climate change are weak. The report suggested that the multiplier effect of climate change will prove to be the greatest threat facing this country. It will make the securing of peace ultimately so much more difficult. In its reporting, the submission covered the well-travelled territory of analysing trends in energy, agriculture, forestry, transport, water, and territorial and marine biodiversity, as well as sectors to do with waste management, land use in general, and pollution. Where the report broke new ground and opens up a potential point of connection with theology lay in its determination to mainstream climate change in education in public and private institutions. Unlike the previous report, this one has emphasised the importance of raising awareness of climate change across disciplines in this country, and interestingly enough, made a call for better representation of the impact of climate change on women and their participation in the debate. Part 3. It is arguably the case that the question has now changed. It is no longer what has theology to do with climate change, as if the question itself is hypothetical. The present has become a time of what the climate ethicist has described as the perfect moral storm. The question is now, what should theology do? How are we to do theology in the Anthropocene? Michael Northcott from Edinburgh puts it a little differently. He asks, who is Jesus Christ for us in the Anthropocene? Who is Jesus Christ for us in a time of climate crisis? There is now a body of work being done in response to these types of questions, and I want to briefly focus on two. The first is an anthology brought together by Northcott and Peter Scott and published under the title of Systematic Theology and Climate Change, Ecumenical Perspectives. Its origins lie in a breakfast discussion at Westcott House in Cambridge during a conference on climate change and ethics. It was recognised that the ethics of such had received much attention, but less so had theology. It was noted that it would not be an easy book to write, and as is the case with fresh ventures in theology, maybe it would be best to organise a group of theologians for the task at hand. When you're beginning to create a new theology, it's very difficult for one person to do that. It's much easier to have a team of people at work on the task. Northcott and Scott contend that Christians have always responded in the past to civilizational crises through a combination of fidelity to scripture and tradition, along with theological and ethical innovation. They presume that climate change is such a crisis. It is one that concerns itself with the habitability of the world. It is one that not only affects the present in ways that are not uniform in their intensity. Some parts of the world, some sections of society, can enjoy indeed what is called climate privilege, but others cannot. It is also a proleptic crisis that looks ahead to the impact on future generations who have no voice of their own in our here and now. And so some current scholars, like George Browning, invoke what they call the grandparent principle, through which they write and campaign on behalf of those yet to be born. This text is nearly a decade old now, but in some regards it has stood the test of time, especially in its introduction. Here Northcott and Scott hark back to the classical definition of theology as faith-seeking understanding. The chapters will follow the normal course of the systematic agenda as contributors explore themes like the Trinity, Christology, the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, creation, creatures, humanity, sin and salvation, the church, and a particularly fine essay by Stephen Krimskar on eschatology. How should the Christian live and act in time of imminent endings, he asks. Are we entering into a period of the need for an interim ethic based on the distinction between a penultimate ending, that is, societies, cultures, life entered through human agency, and the ultimate ending in time through the providence of God and the ushering in of a new creation? Each one of these areas of doctrine are explored through the lens of the climate crisis. Some areas of the systematic agenda are placed under immediately greater pressure than others, most notably the doctrine of providence, which assumes a benevolent God who provides for the continuing creation and a telos, and an ending that is God-willed, rather than one that is the consequence of humanity's mismanagement of the household of creation. 2 years ago, I was given the task of writing 5,000 words for an anthology on climate change and providence. I'd like to say I had a full head of hair then. It was such a difficult task. It was the most difficult piece of work I have ever written. Providence and climate change. Alongside providence is the field of theodicy. While there is a pressing urgency to address what does it mean for us to be human, not simply through categories of sin and being made in the image of God, but now in terms of our power humanity possesses and its codependence on creaturely existence in general. While Celia Dean Drummond rightly argues that a distinctively Christian theology of climate change must also be established on a reading of the incarnation and the redemptive purposes of God. So what you see is the whole field of the systematic theology beginning to engage with climate change. The second example is much more recent. Ernst Conradi and Hilda Costa oversaw the interdisciplinary publication of a Christian theology and climate change. From the outset, it sought to work with others. Those others included climate scientists, evolutionary biologists, environmental economists, politics, climate engineers, artists, climate activists and civil society, climate activists and other religious traditions. They reckon this line of approach amounted to an inverse strategy. That is, it sought to undermine Christian particularity and authenticity. The presumption is that such work requires a spirit of humility, a willingness to learn from others and from other disciplines, and exercise some restraint in not trying to take over the dialogue. Conradi and Costa effectively recognise that a theology of climate change must be transdisciplinary. It must do so, for the very nature of the crisis itself is such that theology should be seeking to play a part in seeking out a moral common ground established in rights and responsibilities. The handbook was self-consciously ecumenical and interreligious. Its point of difference lay in the desire to critique North Atlantic Christianity. Through a series of articles and responses from Conradi and Costa, opted for this kind of hermeneutic on the ground of the countries in the North Atlantic having contributed the vast proportion of historic carbon emissions. It left them conceding that North Atlantic Christianity has arguably legitimised the rise in industrial capitalism and clearly has been unable to stem the tide of increasing carbon emissions. It has, as such, been complicit. They make the claim that theology from this quarter has been as much or more a part of the problem than it may have been a part of the solution. In response to this critique, Conradi and Costa adopt what they call a counterintuitive strategy that is rather risky. The primary contributors were from the North Atlantic context of high carbon footprints. They were asked to write on the grounds of the suspicion that their theology may be as much a part of the problem in mitigating climate change as it may be the solution. The editors then invited a critique from other contexts that may have been in the polar opposite, the most vulnerable to that of the contributor. So they sought to strike up a dialogue. The handbook set out to address the impact and implications of climate change through a theological interpretation of God's story. The narrative Conradi and Costa identified through a broad range of theological areas of beliefs and doctrines, though not always named in quite the same way as Northcott and Scott. Conclusion. What then has theology to do with climate change? The situation has changed. We are now actually doing theology in a time of climate change. We are now doing theology in the age of the Anthropocene. The present has become a kairos moment for such. It lends itself to working with other disciplines. What motivates the Christian present is the theological conviction that this is God's good creation and all things were made in, through and for Christ, as is indicated in the hymn in Colossians 1:15-20. The task of a Christian public theology on climate change is bilingual. It seeks to address matters in the public domain and of common concern in an accessible language. It must also seek to speak back into the life of the church, and indeed, in this instance, support congregational initiatives. Bergman and Dieter Gerten have argued that even in straitened times, the church and its institutions have a role to play. They help foster belief systems and practices that bear witness to the purposes of God and how the household of creation may be managed. They show concern for the most vulnerable, and they also seek to transcend the constraints of times in which we live out our own personal lives, and they are necessarily communal. After all, Jesus invited us to read the signs of the times.
Microphone, please. Thank you very much. We are in a context of crisis now. Listening to this, that doesn't make us very happy, very cheerful. But of course, it is facing reality and raising awareness, as you said, was one of the tasks of theology. And now it's time for us to ask some questions, whether of clarification or of implications of what Dr. Clive has just presented us. Hopefully, when a microphone can come. Yeah, if you can speak loudly, then we can try.
Okay. Last week I was watching television. There were demonstrations in London. Most of the people demonstrating for the subject you're talking about now are young. Now, I want to know if the church in general is trying to lure these people back into belief. You know, have there been attempts to see if they already are believers, or they just take up this particular issue without necessarily going back to God and to religion and so on, or if there are ways of luring them back into God's.
Well, I don't think, first of all, that using climate change could be seen as a subtle missional strategy to win back young people, but I think you're quite right that young people do have a very profound concern for the future that is unfolding. And within my own denomination, there has been a very strong emphasis from young people, both at school and university level, just in general, of having a concern for the relationship between faith and climate change. I see part of my task, and people who I've taught and what their future ministries may be like, is that I do think it's important to provide those who are within the life of the church, who are on the vicinity of the life of the church. I think it's very important to be able to give them a Christian, a theological understanding of why we should be concerned about climate change and its implications. It was noticeable that prior to the development of an ecological theology, which really happened in the 1990s mainly, many people who were environmentally activist and who were part and parcel of the church had split personalities. They had compartmentalized minds. They had their environmental, ecological concern in one part of their mind, but it didn't necessarily engage with their life of faith. And I think it's very important to try and have those kind of conversations happening within the same head.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pearson. Could you comment a little bit on the degrowth movement? So I think one of the big enemies for climate change is the growth paradigm. So is there like a promise there for theology, so that we should diminish, reduce, rather than grow? Thank you.
this can go a couple of ways, because on the one hand you can have those people who will speak about the possibility of what they call a good Anthropocene. I think it's more likely to be ugly, but they will speak about a good Anthropocene whereby technology can be used to assist, as Earl Ellis calls, the great majority of people. So you do have people who would want to argue that you should still be encouraging economic growth and research and development and getting technology, and somehow we will find the magic solutions to problems. My own feeling is that that is probably unlikely. The other side of that is, I think what is quite interesting is that for several decades now, there have been numerous economic reports attached to climate change which actually speak about the need to have radical transformations into the capitalist system. It's interesting how many corporations now have an environmental concern and are wanting to at least promote the idea that they have a climate change sensibility. Whether or not that's a Trojan horse is another matter. I think it's also been fascinating that the IPCC recently has made much more room, and it certainly did a couple of years ago, for indigenous worldviews which are much more relational between humanity and the rest of creation. So you do have two trajectories going. You do have people who emphasise continued growth and technological advance. But I think there's a strong counter story to that as well, and I think it's the counter story which is probably the more valuable and important.
Thank you very much. I'm part of the social issues class where we read the last weeks about consumerism, seeking economic justice, also now ecology. And theological contributions were often pointing in the end towards like the attitude of believers, how to consume, how to live generous, how to live a life of simplicity. And you said it's easy to talk about it in church circles or in lectures, but there was also like kind of my conclusion in the end. It points often towards the believer himself. And now my question is, what is really the outcome of doing theology in public, and maybe also what is the outcome of your work in the public discussion? What does really theology change there that is going beyond the single believer changing his or her behaviors?
That's good and bad. I have written a number of articles on climate change in cities because I think there needs to be an urgent attention given to the intersection of climate change and cities. And as I've travelled around Beirut over the last 2 or 3 days, that thought has been running through my mind consistently, really. And I would have to say, although I have written in that kind of territory, there is no way that I have been invited to be part and parcel of any kind of civil society that has been, or local authority. They tend to go towards their climate scientists and their economists and their urban planners. That is true. But you can have a more indirect effect. What I would highlight here is that when I began my address this evening, I spoke about how there was a gap between what was happening between the workday world of some of the people within my congregation and also what happened on Sunday. Well, I went to spend quite a lot of time with 1 or 2 of those people along the way, and they began to write on land management and theology, and they were doing it for the sake of their disciplines, not for the sake of the church. So it wasn't it wasn't so much my direct function, it was them. It was empowering them to find their voice for their situation. I can perhaps also use one good news story about consequences and impact. I have just finished supervising a doctoral thesis from Tuvalu. Am I not your Turkoi? Am I not your neighbour? This man has been the convener of the United Nations Indigenous Forum on Climate Change. He has spoken and organises events at every COP conference. He has been invited to address the German Parliament. He had a sideshow at one COP conference on Am I Not Your Neighbour? And the Australian Prime Minister was in touch with him the next day. So again, it's not necessarily your own personal role, because one has to accept one's limits, but you can empower others to speak in the forum that they find themselves in. And indeed, everywhere he goes now, this fellow Maina is using the parable of the Good Samaritan every time he stands up to talk. Am I not your neighbour? And he's doing it on a geopolitical stage. And he has to be listened to. He's regularly interviewed on radio, television, and quite often features in the Guardian newspaper.
I have a question, but I don't know how to phrase it actually properly. But it draws on the question that Aaron raised. Actually, your biggest conversation partner, unless if you define the public sphere with the people that I'm going to mention, your biggest conversation partners are really the big industrial corporations in this world. That's where the damage, that's the source of damage. Does your public theology or environmental theology have these people in mind, and is throwing this theology into the public? Are you sure it's going to appeal to these big corporations? I haven't heard you say anything about this. You described the problem, but you didn't point out the source of the problem. What is theology trying to do to this source?
That's another lecture in many ways. It presupposes how we, first of all, define what the public domain is, and indeed, and the way in which engages with different spheres in the public domain is not the same. You can be involved, say, at the governmental level. You can, and I've come from a denomination which has frequently in the past made overtures to government on matters of climate change. You can also be involved in a second level on the economics, the corporations and what have you. And I think that one can be one voice among many voices which are now saying to corporations that they need to be much more aware of the threat to climate. I do recall that I did have, on one occasion, one of my students was a very high-powered figure in one of the energy companies in Australia, the biggest. And after he completed his eco-theology course, he resigned. So perhaps that was a mild success. There's also, I think, how you engage with other NGOs and other religious traditions. And I know that within my own field that I've had quite a bit to do with Muslim scholars within Sydney, and they are now talking about climate change in a way which they had never done so before. And I think there's also the way in which you intersect also with media and social media. So the public sphere is multifaceted, and I think the kind of discourses that you have with the public sphere change depending on which one you're engaged with. But it is true that the corporations exercise heavyweight power. But I think that there are some changes happening, but whether or not it's fast enough is not a matter.
May I follow this to the question? Until that theology begins to take roots, what's your advice to the church about how it should live until that theology takes roots in this the church live in the present? How can the church live responsibly toward the environment?
I think there are a variety of responses to that as well. Let me first start at a congregational level. I am well aware of a number of congregations which have set up what they called earth ministries, where someone was employed within the life of that congregation to help raise awareness of ecological and climate issues within the life of the neighbourhood, and also form relationships with other associations that were accessible within their own neighbourhood. There are quite a lot of churches which have gone through putting things like solar panels on their roofs and what have you, but I think there's also a way of encouraging the life of worship, so that there are options of hymns, for instance, which have that ecological concern. That needs to be encouraged. Denominations, I think that denominations can actually declare that a concern for the integrity of creation, the integrity of, and the response to climate change is a prime concern, and to have it undergirded by a sound theology. I think one should also, in the church, encourage theologians who are involved in this kind of field to speak out and be heard. The very first time I began to teach on climate change and the environment, I was walking across the car park. And one young guy, who quite clearly was not about to take the course, simply said to me, "Of course, it's not the gospel, is it?" He couldn't see that he was standing inside that dominant majority tradition, and maybe that needs to be challenged, so that we are much more aware of how we are called to care for the creation, and with particular reference to climate. I think there are ways of encouraging the life of the church, but I think it has to be very intentional.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pearson, for this intervention. I'm so glad to be here, and especially for the topic, because you may know from Reverend Rima that we at MCC are planning a symposium on eco-theology, and precisely on this topic, what theology, how theology should be concerned by the climate change and the creation care. So. I can say, if I may say, the key point of your intervention is the sign of times. How to read this, how to interpret, or how to see, to watch, to be aware of the sign of times. Theology is also, so it's a part of the theological work. But the essential part is reading the Word of God and announcing this word in this time, so after interpreting, after really understanding the sign of times. This morning I was my fundamental theology course, at the end, was talking about Christ, the fullness of revelation. And I remind my students about that we have a third book of revelation. Christ, Jesus Christ, the fullness of revelation, not only in what he said during his ministry, but because he is, as Word of God, at work since the creation and through the prophet, the Old Testament, And the father of the church said that we have a third book, the book of creation, that we, church, theology, faithful, we have to read it, in addition to the book of the Old Book and the Prophet and the New Testament. Maybe we should also emphasize this: when the environment and the creation is damaged, I cannot read this book something is failed for the theology also. So not only that sign of times, but also the book of creation. Thank you.
Which is Sally McFay would say is at risk of uncreation, which we need to be aware of as well.
Who was with their hands up?
I'm a physician. I look at what's happening in health. That point of view, when I see it again as part of the acceleration of these viruses that are coming from other genuses from birds, since the HIV virus and the coronavirus, the acceleration of that phenomenon over the past 20 years is clearly a result of the invasion of the earth, and the destruction of ecosystems by the human ecosystem. So it fits with the Anthropocene age, whereby we are now determining what's happening to the earth, whereas before it was the ice and so forth. But this is not what is, from a theological point of view, expected to happen. I mean, the teachings of Christ about the fact that the history is moving in a specific direction, it's not cyclical, and that direction is not ending in human history by people becoming better. I think people are becoming more and more evil, the number of believers becoming less, and those who kill Christians or kill those who believe in Christ will be doing a service for God, and that this environmental part of it, that has to do with nature, is part of the overall increase in human evil. It's not that the environment is what's driving us, but it's human evil that's driving it. And the environment is part of one of the victims, as health, as are the animals, as are humans themselves, of increasing human greed. And the church maybe should not be focusing on the earth, but on the people who are causing the earth to become what it is.
But I certainly think that the life of faith, the church, should have a very strong moral voice within these kind of concerns, and that presupposes having a sufficient kind of understanding of what is happening in terms of climate change, earth system sciences and what have you, as well as how that might intersect with theology. So I think we do need the theological knowledge to have that kind of strong moral voice. And I think we're stretching boundaries at the moment. Those of us who have been working in the field of theology and climate change / the Anthropocene are often finding that we are having to deal with headaches about how do some of our received understandings of the Christian faith relate to this changing circumstance in which we find ourselves in. Part of what you are intimating there, I think, has to do with the doctrine of providence, which I said was so problematic. Ms. Conradi, whose name I mentioned a moment ago, has organised about a group of about 10 or 12 of us to write a specific volume on providence, climate change, and each one of us is struggling with it. It is stretching us. So where it leads, I have no idea at the moment.
I think we can take one last question before... one last question.
I was waiting for the theological wave to calm down, because I'm not a theologian, so I don't want to be like an atheist among you. Let me raise my question in the following way. What about the induced climate change? i.e. cutting water from a country to another, or sending dump or nuclear waste from a country to another. This is the biggest issue for me now in the Middle East and in Africa. Middle East, Iraq and Syria versus Turkey. In the Middle East, Egypt versus Ethiopia and so on, till Libya, and throwing all these nuclear waste in some deserts in Africa, Southern Africa. Thank you.
Well, I can't respond to that theologically. But it does seem to me that quite often churches, either denominationally or ecumenically, can make statements on things that they believe are harmful and can popularise that. So I think that it's all part and parcel of a much bigger strategy, I think. And indeed, I think that the Pope's Laudato Si, where he speaks about an integral ecology, I mean, he's drawing together so many of the things that you just referred to, and he weaves around it a kind of a theological fabric. But it's all held together, and of course it's not just him doing it, he has a whole big commission as well as that head of a Roman Catholic Church, so it's an institutional response.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that we have a lot of questions, and I hope that this is again another stimulus for us to keep thinking about this very important topic. Climate change is driving us. Well, we are trying as theologians to connect our faith with what is happening in climate change, but I think it's the other way around as well. Climate change is making us critical of our own theologies, and that is a dialectic that she needs to keep stay alive, and we need each other, as you mentioned, so that we can keep thinking about this. Each other as theologians and each other as across disciplines and boundaries. So thank you very much again. We are all invited to continue the discussion outside around a cup of coffee or tea. One more time, thank you, Clive, for being with us.